Welcome to this introductory course on Defense in Depth and Secure Network Design. Thanks for joining me. My name is Josh Moulin, Principal at Natsar. Thanks for watching. Before you dive in, I wanted to share that you can earn continuing education credit for this content. Just visit natsar.com and register for free to access this presentation. Instructions and a link to access it are available below. Upon completion, you'll receive a certificate of attendance, which can be used toward continuing education hours. It's our way of giving back to the cybersecurity community. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date on our latest videos and other resources to aid you in your cybersecurity journey. Also, feel free to explore our on-demand courses and other valuable cybersecurity resources at natsar.com. As we go through the objectives of this particular course, we'll first look at the principles of defense in depth, sometimes known as layered security, and we'll look at how it enhances your resilience against cyber attacks. We'll also look at the roles of network security tools such as firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, and even talk a little bit about zero trust network access and network segmentation. You'll learn the importance of DNS, domain name system security strategies, to protect against DNS-based attacks. We'll also look at some of the benefits and challenges of virtual private networks, or VPNs, both for home users and for an enterprise environment. And again, we'll talk about network segmentation a bit and how that can help us reduce the attack surface of our organizations. So let's kick it off with an introduction to defense in depth. Have you ever heard the term, don't put all your eggs in one basket? Well, if so, that really sums up defense in depth, or sometimes called layered security. The idea here is that you want to put as many different roadblocks between your critical information and systems and a cyber adversary, whether it's internal or external, as you can. And we want to have various controls and levers that we can use as cyber defenders to make sure that there are significant hurdles for those adversaries, and if one of our systems fails or it's not the right kind of system to combat a certain type of attack, hopefully we have something else behind it as a backstop that will prevent all the different types of attacks that we may get exposed to. Now, layers can include physical security. Could be something like you have a fence around your building and then you have special locks and access control to physically get into the building. And then even within there, you've got a locked room with limited access for your data centers and your critical systems. It doesn't always have to be cyber, but often we marry the two, where we've got physical security protections and network security protections, endpoint security like EDR, endpoint detection and response, application security, data security, all of these things to create multiple barriers between the adversary and our systems. Now, effective defense in depth does require integration of policies, procedures, and technologies, because there's not always a technical control to every challenge that we face in cybersecurity. By technical control, I mean something we can implement technologically, like a firewall or DNS filtering to block people from going to certain websites, or a sandbox to catch malicious emails. Sometimes we need administrative controls, policies, and procedures, because there may be something we don't want people to do, but we don't have a technical solution. So the best we can do is raise awareness and have some sort of administrative control, like a policy or a procedure, to help us combat those kinds of threats. In this session, I'll talk about a number of network security tools. Now, I'm not going to deep dive any one of these because that's not really the point of this particular course. Sometime in the future, maybe I will, but I do want to go through some of the terminology and the devices that you may hear about as we talk about network security specifically. So oftentimes in the cybersecurity and IT space, we hear about next gen, the next generation of pretty much everything. And firewalls is no exclusion to that. But there have been some significant advances in the firewalls of 15 years ago to the firewalls of today, where they really are next gen. They do much more than just simply looking at packets and sessions going in and out of networks. But they're really more these UTM, or Unified Threat Management devices. They very well could have other security tools built into them beyond a stateful firewall that looks at sessions going on and ports and protocols in use and a number of other things. They could have DLP, or data loss prevention tools. They could have intrusion detection tools. A number of different things could be integrated into a single appliance that you're using. Now, there's also, of course, the cloud. So Sometimes, in fact, many times, organizations have to deal with not only on-premise things with their security, so they may have a data center and they have to secure that physically and also virtually with firewalls and IDS systems, etc. But they also have resources in the cloud. It could be a software as a service or SaaS. It could be infrastructure as a service, IaaS, or platform as a service, PaaS, or something else that they are using in the cloud. So there's also security network tools that we think of, such as cloud access security brokers or CASBs, or cloud workforce protection platforms, CWPPs. And if you haven't caught on already in cybersecurity, we love our acronyms, and vendors do too. So it's one of those things that you'll need to get a glossary out as you get into this career if you're not already in it. And then there's network sandboxes. Now there's a few different kinds of sandboxes out there. There's some that sit on a network, and as files traverse various systems across the network, this sandbox will grab a file, it'll what's called detonate it, meaning it opens the file up and it sees what that file does once it's opened. Is it a malicious Word document, an Excel file, a zipped file that has malware in it? Is it a PDF that has some sort of call out to a foreign IP address, etc. There's also email sandboxes that work the same way, but instead of looking at network traffic going across your network, it's looking at incoming email to look at the links that are embedded in the emails, or again, attachments to see if there's anything wrong with them. Sandboxes can be put in line where they grab these documents and these files in real time, and then you can make a determination. Do you want to delay the delivery of those packets or that email until the sandbox gives the all clear, or do you want to let things go, allow the sandbox to catch up, do its analysis, and then if it finds something, it alerts your SOC, your Security Operations Center, or someone like that? Those are all operational questions that you would have to think through for what's best for you. There's also network intrusion detection and prevention systems. Sometimes it still is said this way, but especially years ago, there was NIDS, Network Intrusion Detection Systems. There was NIPS, Network Intrusion Prevention Systems. So you'd have detection and prevention as two separate capabilities, and sometimes you'd have NIDS devices that you could just flip a switch and all of a sudden it's now blocking. That's really the difference between detection and prevention. On the detection side, it's simply looking at packets, comparing those packets generally to signatures, and then alerting someone if there's a match. But it's not actually taking any action. They're safer because you don't have the ability or the worry about blocking legitimate traffic, but also if no one's watching the shop and alerts are coming out and these malicious packets are going across the wire, it's really not doing anything to help. So that's where intrusion prevention systems, or IPS, come into play. There's host-based as well. HIPS, Host Intrusion Prevention System, HIDS, HIDS, Host Intrusion Detection Systems. But that we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for this network security part, we're just going to talk about those packets coming into and out of the network, as well as even packets traversing internally. And I'll talk a little bit about network segmentation and monitoring internal traffic in just a bit. There's also proxies for web traffic and other things where you can control the queries and the web traffic coming out of your organization. There's network taps and full packet capture, which really means that you are using your network infrastructure like a spanning port on a switch to capture all the traffic going across that device or that network segment and monitoring it. You can also capture the packets and being able to replay attacks and to really see exactly what's going on, to deep dive it. That's a great tool to have in a forensic analysis and some sort of incident response case. Now, there's lots of considerations when you're thinking about doing full packet capture, but it is something that we see in network security. Breach and attack simulation tools, or BAS tools, are being more and more popular, and that's where organizations are able to use software tools to simulate an attack and then see how their systems would have caught it, or in some cases not caught that attack. Of course, we have vulnerability scanning engines that are hopefully out there scanning our internal and external network and systems for known vulnerabilities, both from the perspective of an adversary that has no visibility into our system, so uncredentialed scans, as well as credentialed scans, or what more is available to you if you actually had accounts in the network. And then another thing that we would talk about a little bit is security information and event management, or SIM tools. And SIM tools are designed for security analytics, where you can capture a large amount of data. So you've got the collection and then the correlation and the aggregation of all of that information. So instead of getting alerts from your EDR vendor and from your IDS vendor and from your firewall vendor or your managed service provider, a SIM tool allows all of that to come in, and it can be normalized across time zones, and it allows a SOC analyst or an incident responder, for example, to look across everything going on in the environment, not just these onesie-twosie alerts you might get from various systems. And then they can search across it. And a SIM tool is critically important to be able to do effective incident response and to have a SOC, because it just gives so much more visibility to your analysts. Here's a defense in depth chart that I put together that I wanted to run through, and we won't go through every single one of these, but this is an example of how many organizations will set up their security to make sure that when we look at the very middle yellow circle there, mission critical systems and data, they want to make sure that's really hard to get into. So we'll start at the bottom. On the left-hand side, you have what we call GRC, governance, risk, and compliance activities. Most of these are administrative controls, but not all of them. So things like awareness training. So we teach our employees not to click links and how to spot things and who to report things to if something goes wrong. We've got our security engineering team that are just building things securely for us out of the gate. Supply chain management and risk assessments, policies, doing vulnerability scans and penetration testing is all on that GRC side. If we look on the other side, detection and response activities, this is where we are doing things like tabletop exercises, making sure we have all the logs that we need in a SIM, like I was mentioning before. We're doing continuous monitoring. We're looking at threat intelligence. Now, obviously, not every organization will be fortunate enough to have all of these, but certainly I've worked in organizations that do have all of these, and I've consulted with many that do as well as organizations that have almost none of these. So this is just, again, an example, but it hopefully shows you how we really use different areas to make sure, again, we don't put all our eggs in one basket. We don't just have endpoint detection and response like Microsoft Defender or CrowdStrike or something like that on our system, and we say, hey, we're good. We don't need to do anything else. That's not the point of defense in depth. So if we start in the middle, we've already talked about the sides. We have data security, so things like data loss prevention, encrypting our data, masking our data so people don't see social security numbers and things of that nature in our databases. We move up to the application layer. So here we have things like application control. So we're able to say, these are the applications we allow to run in our network. We do secure coding with DevSecOps. We have database monitoring. We have things like a WAF, a web application firewall. Now we move up, endpoint security. So here we have the actual endpoints that our users are using. And there's a lot of tools for that. Of course, we're going to scan for vulnerabilities, hopefully have them all protected with multi-factor authentication. We're patching those. We have an EDR agent on them. Hopefully the host-based firewall is enabled. If it's something that can leave the office, it should have full disk encryption. And if we have mobile devices, they should be managed with an MDM solution. Then we go to the network layer. Things like VPNs, if you're using VoIP phone systems, Wi-Fi, web content filtering, network segmentation, the sandbox that I mentioned, and many other things are in that network layer. And then finally, we go to the outside, the perimeter security. And there's, again, a lot of tools here. We've got perimeter firewalls, intrusion detection, maybe a way to prevent denial of service attacks. We have our secure email gateway, DLP, again, data loss prevention, to make sure that files don't actually leave our perimeter that are maybe company secret or controlled unclassified information or something like that. And then you see even honeypots and things like that would be in this perimeter security layer. So there's a lot of different technology and processes and policies involved in implementing all of these things in the right way. And really, for you to know what you should be doing is going to be based on your budget, your resources, your personnel, and your risk. So some organizations have a very low risk level and they may not need all of these things. But then there's also things that are just basic cyber hygiene that everybody should be doing in any company size, like EDR, like a perimeter firewall, things like that. that you should at least at a minimum be doing some of these. Now let's jump into domain name system or DNS security. Imagine if you saw this billboard when you were driving down the road. Visit our website at 34.149.120.3 to learn more. Who would ever remember that or even know what the heck that was? Now, you actually can type in an IP address to a browser and it will go to that website. However, that's obviously not something that's user-friendly or anything that we would ever want to do on advertisements or just talking to people. So that's really why DNS came to be. It's the domain name system. It's a way to make those numbers into something that's humanly readable and things that we're familiar with that we can use, those domain names that we're all so used to using. Now, DNS has a lot of functions, and we won't get into nearly all of them now, but I do want to introduce you to some of the core concepts with DNS. As an overview, DNS translates human-readable domain names like example.com into IP addresses that allow browsers to make those connections to websites. So while we type in www.google.com, our computer actually in the background will look up, find out who has that domain, which server at which IP address, and then route our traffic to that web server or whatever resource we're trying to get to as appropriate. In the background, it's all IP addresses, numbers. It's not any of these domain names, but like I mentioned in the slide previously with the billboard, we would never be able to function if all we had to do is remember IP addresses. From a cybersecurity perspective, DNS is critical to the internet infrastructure, and attackers often target this for malicious purposes. I've often said if you own DNS, you really own everything because you can control where people and systems go. And I'll show you here in just a minute on how that's possible. There's a few different attacks with DNS. DNS spoofing is one thing, which I'll show you an example of, and also cache poisoning, which can redirect users to fraudulent sites. An example of cache poisoning, and what that means is there's a variety of steps that computers use to look up DNS information. There can be local DNS servers, and then there's authoritative DNS servers, and there can be DNS servers at various companies that will check and get the answer back to your computer so it knows where to route its traffic. Those systems and even your company and your home may cache those answers. So not every time you want to go to Google does it have to go through all those steps to find out where Google is. It may ask once, get the answer, and then cache it locally for some amount of time that can be predetermined. So if you ask for it again, it just has to look up in its local records and say, oh, I've already looked up Google. It's this IP address. Go. Instead of all the back and forth. Obviously, it happens very, very quickly and you don't even notice it, but still, it just helps build efficiency. Now, if I, as the attacker, can get into that cache and say, actually, Google doesn't exist at that IP address. It exists at my malicious website that I've hosted in AWS or Vultr or some other hosting provider. So when your computer says, go to www.google.com, when it hits the DNS cache, it's actually directed to the evil server and not the legitimate one. So that's a very simplistic example of DNS cache poisoning, but hopefully you get the idea of how that can be detrimental, especially if an adversary hacks a company's DNS server and starts redirecting people to all sorts of malicious sites. DNS can be used to enhance security through techniques like DNS filtering. We'll talk more about that. This helps block access to known malicious sites or IP addresses and can help protect users from threats. There's also DNS security protocols like DNSSEC, DNS security extensions, which adds a layer of verification to ensure the integrity of DNS responses. So if you email me at natsar.com, I have DNSSEC enabled for my domain, so it actually knows what IP addresses and what hosting providers are associated with my domain name. And if anyone else tries to send an email from natsar.com, it's going to fail that DNSSEC check. And there's other email tools we use too, but this is just an example of how DNSSEC can help just validate that you actually are the owner of a domain, or the person you're communicating with is the owner or the appropriate person for that domain. And then we'll talk a little bit more too about DNS over HTTPS, or DOH. This is kind of interesting because it encrypts DNS queries by sending them over an encrypted channel like HTTPS rather than traditional DNS protocols. So generally DNS is sent over UDP instead of TCP, and that's a fire and forget protocol. So I send this packet to the destination and I hope it gets there, but I get no validation that it did, like TCP, where I get an actual response back. With UDP and DNS over port 53, it's also unencrypted. So if I'm on the same Wi-Fi network as you and you're doing all these different web browsing sessions and you have applications reaching out to domains, I can see all of that. I know all the different domains that you are going to, as does your internet service provider and anyone else sitting on that network potentially. A lot of times people don't want others to see what websites are going to, so DNS over HTTPS cuts all of that out. All somebody will see is you're making a DNS request to a secure DNS server. I'll show you an example of this, but they cannot see what your actual query is. They just see this HTTPS traffic back and forth that is a secure DNS lookup. And this can really help for privacy and security in some cases, but there is some downsides to it that we'll talk about in a little bit. But a teaser is if you're using things like DNS filtering and you're saying, don't let anyone go to this domain name because it's on the bad list. Well, if they're using DOH, you have no idea if they are going to that because you're encrypting all that traffic. So there's pros and cons just like everything else in security, but you should be aware of that. If you enable DOH because you think it makes a lot of sense and then you realize that you just broke your DNS filtering system, that's why. And there are some ways around it. You could do breaking encryption, inspection, and then re-encrypting it on the way out, but that's very expensive, a lot of overhead, and a lot of organizations don't do it for a variety of reasons. So you're probably not going to be doing that, but it is possible. But there really, sometimes there might be more reasons to do it than not to do it. And sometimes for your use case, you might say, we can't afford to do that. We really need to be able to see all the DNS queries coming out of our organization. So the benefits of DNS over HTTPS is it does prevent third parties like your ISPs or attackers from snooping on your DNS queries. So if you don't want your ISP, for example, to know every single domain name that you're going to, then using something like this might be a really good idea. It also does provide some security against those man-in-the-middle or adversary-in-the-middle attacks by encrypting the DNS traffic as it goes across. So as I mentioned, if you're on the Wi-Fi network at Starbucks or in a hotel and you're not using a VPN, which we'll talk about in a little bit, then anyone else on that Wi-Fi network at Starbucks can see at least your system's IP address and MAC address and all the DNS queries that you're making if you're not using some other tool like Chrome's built-in ability to do DOH or something else. If you're just using kind of the vanilla standard capabilities, then anyone else on that network may be able to see what you're asking for. But it does help users bypass censorship because, again, you can't do that filtering to say don't allow people to go to these IPs or these domain names because we don't want them to for whatever reason. And if you're using DOH, then it won't be able to see the domain names that you're trying to get to. It can be more challenging in a corporate environment to monitor these things because of all the things I've already mentioned. And it can allow people to bypass internal security controls. So if you're using a DNS filtering solution, let's say a big use case we see all the time is elementary schools, or actually any school really, that says, well, I don't want our users to be able to get to adult websites. So we will just categorically block adult content using DNS. So if you try and go to a website that is known to be an adult website, it will just block you. You cannot get out to that site. If you're using DOH, you would not be able to do that same thing because the filtering system won't see the DNS name that you're going to. But there's also other things like malicious websites. So there's lots of threat intelligence lists out there that have lists of known bad domains that you would want anybody really to be protected from. So you might put in DNS filtering at your business based on a list of constantly updated feeds of bad domains. And if you're using DOH, then those requests are not going to be blocked necessarily because your filtering system might not be able to see them. So let's look at a standard DNS query that we would see in a normal application. So here we see this computer is going to make a request for the website of natsar.com. So the user types into their browser www.natsar.com. Let's say this is a home user. It goes through their default gateway, which is their wireless router connected to their cable modem, then goes to their ISP DNS server. And we'll just say in this example, it's Spectrum. And when they look up natsar.com, Spectrum comes back and says the IP address where that domain name is pointing to is 34.149.120.3. That message coming back over UDP port 53 comes to your computer, just like it shows here, and then your computer makes a connection request to the web server at 34.149.120.3 asking for that website. And because this is an encrypted website using HTTPS, it would be over port 443. And then there would be a TCP handshake between your system and the web server, and you'd be browsing this particular website. All right, let's take an example now of using a simple DOH website request. So here we're going to be using Cloudflare as our DNS provider, which they have free secure DNS that you can use. The primary DNS IP address is 1.1.1.1, and you can use a secondary of 1.1.1.2 if you're interested. So in this example, you have your PC here where you're going to be making a request. So all of you that you see is now going to https chrome.cloudflare-dns.com. Now, I'm using the Chrome browser for this example, but it would go through my wireless access point. From my home, it would then go to our internet service provider DNS lookup, which would not be able to see my request. So then it would forward it on to the domain of cloudflare-dns.com. It goes to Cloudflare's DNS server here. It is then able to decrypt my request, see where I'm actually trying to go, and it then answers me over HTTPS, so it's an encrypted communication, through Spectrum, back to my access point, back to my desktop. My desktop then unencrypts the request, finds out this is the IP address I'm trying to go to, and sends me to that domain. So I know on my computer what domain I'm going to, but nobody between knows where I'm going. And this is really helpful for a number of reasons, as I mentioned, DNS spoofing and eavesdropping. And also, just one note to remember, while it does keep things private in this area, it does not help your desktop at all. So this is where there's a difference between security on the local machine versus network security. So while you got the network covered, if anyone was to do forensics on your desktop, for instance, they would still see cookies and they would see the domain requests that you made on your system, internet history files, and typed URLs potentially, unless you're using something like private browsing or incognito mode. And then there may not be any remnant left on your desktop or the network. So combining those two can really give you a private session. So again, this is just an example, quickly, very high level, of DOH and how it's different from what we just looked at with a traditional DNS unsecure request. Let's look at an example of how DNS security can work in an environment. This graphic is from the Center for Internet Security, CIS, where I used to work as a senior vice president. I'm very familiar with this particular product. It's MDBR, Malicious Domain Blocking and Reporting, that they offer at no cost to any state, local, tribal, or territorial government in the United States. The way this particular security capability works is by looking at DNS requests and determining whether or not those requests are malicious or if they are authentic and something that should be allowed to go through. So in this example, we have a U.S. hospital. They made a request to www.badsite.com. Now, this does not mean a user actually typed that URL into their browser. It could be that, but it could also be that they clicked a link in an email, that they clicked a link in a text, that it was something on social media, some software landed on their computer and is now beaconing out to another domain to do a second stage dropper for additional malware. There's a number of reasons why this system might be going out to this website. So it first hits the internal DNS server of the hospital. Remember I mentioned that there's lots of stages of DNS queries. This particular example, this hospital has its own DNS server. It then says, I don't know anything about that domain. I'm going to pass you along to our external DNS lookup, which because of this product from CIS, this request is now forwarded to Akamai, who is the service provider for MDBR. Akamai then looks up badsite.com and says, oh, you know what? That matches our list of malicious domains. It's not always based on an actual lookup or a list or a signature. There's also heuristics and machine learning involved. It looks at things like how long has this domain been in existence? Was it just purchased and created today? Or has it been around for a while? Is it associated with known malicious infrastructure? Who owns the domain? There's lots of different things that it will look up. Has it ever been seen before? Are other users going to it? Has anybody reported it as malicious, etc.? Now, Akamai says, we've seen this site and it's not something you should be going to. So it actually then goes back to the hospital, all the way back to the end user's computer and says, sorry, you're not going to be able to go to that site. It actually provides a splash screen that comes up that says that you can customize this. I used to do this when I was in the federal government. We called it a pink screen. It would come up. It was kind of a pinkish color that said, the request you just made was blocked for the following reasons. And they could make a request to IT to have it unblocked. And there were sometimes legitimate reasons for that happening. But sometimes users didn't even know they were trying to go somewhere and it was some malicious process or something. So the hospital user gets some sort of pop-up and that's really it. There's no further connection. So Akamai does not forward that on to the website or to anywhere else. It just simply lets the user know you're not going there. But it does then send a report to the CIS SOC here, letting them know that a user at this particular hospital tried to go to a malicious site. This has a lot of intelligence value because then you can start looking at, did we start seeing a campaign? Is there a lot of users across our user base that are trying to go to this URL that we've never seen before? What's going on with this domain? Do we need to be looking up that domain with our email security products to see if we should be putting blocks in place there? There's a lot of different things that this can be really helpful for. Now, the other thing that this can be helpful for is letting this hospital IT and cybersecurity staff know you've got a system beaconing out to a malicious website. You need to go figure out what that device is and find out why. Maybe it's compromised. So usually in this internal DNS server, there should be logs that exist because all Akamai sees is the public IP address of the hospital going to them. They do not see the internal, what's called an RFC 1918 IP address of the internal workstation. That is not shown to them. So while Akamai can report that the hospital looked something up that was malicious, it can't say it was this desktop or this mobile device or this user. That then would need to be done by the hospital IT staff so they can correlate the date and time and the URL that was looked up with their internal DNS logs and look back and say, oh, okay, that was John's desktop, this internal IP address. Somebody go look at John's computer and see what's going on. It could be a user that was doing something they shouldn't have been. It could be a malicious site. It could have been a phishing email, who knows what, but you want to go investigate those things. Let's look at a DNS spoofing attack. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but let's just say for example here, you want to go to facebook.com and you browse facebook.com. You go through your wireless router here at home and it says, all right, over UDP port 53, where is facebook.com? And generally, this would go to a DNS server at, let's say, Spectrum. This should look familiar to you. And then I mentioned, again, there's a lot of different areas to ask. So could go to the root DNS server, could go to a top-level domain server, and to Facebook itself to find out who has this facebook.com IP address. And you see the answer is right here, this 157.54.30.35. The problem, though, I'll back up a little bit. In a normal circumstance, this is how it would work. You would ask this blue line, it gets these different answers, and then it comes back to you in this orange, and your website would then connect to 157.54.30.35, just like that example I showed you, somebody going to natsar.com. Now, in this case, the attacker replaces that IP address with 110.17.1.1, which goes to his or her fake site sitting on, let's say, a web server in Amazon Web that they actually scraped the real Facebook, made it look like completely legitimate. You think I went to Facebook, the website that came back to me is Facebook, everything looks great. I'm going to put my username, password, and multi-factor authentication in there when I log in, and it may actually log you into something just to make it look more legit, or it might just not work. But the bottom line is they have then captured your full credentials, and they can quickly log into your real Facebook account. Now, Facebook would be the least of your worries. What if this was your bank or even your email or something like that? So this is how DNS can be so damaging, because they can tell your computer and redirect it to a different one instead of what the legitimate one should actually be. So I also mentioned the cache poisoning, DNS cache poisoning. Instead of actually being in the middle here and intercepting this traffic and making changes, they can do a couple things. One, an attacker could make themselves look like the DNS server internally, and all the DNS requests would go through them, and they could do whatever they want with them. They also could get into this server and replace the cache and hard code IP addresses in for commonly looked up URLs. So they could say, anytime someone goes to facebook.com, tell them the IP address is this 110.17.1.1 address. Anytime somebody goes to Google, tell them it's this address. And they could do that for really whatever they want. So this is just more graphically an example of what I was explaining earlier of how DNS attacks can be so powerful, because users don't see this. It's transparent to them. Now, one thing, and this is why we train users, always be looking for that padlock and the HTTPS in the URL bar of their browsers, and also to be looking for certificate mismatches, because unless the certificate matches the URL you're going to, you should be getting prompted by a mismatch. And you've seen those before where it'll say the certificate is not right. Would you like to proceed? Use caution. A lot of users unfortunately just say, yeah, sure, I'll proceed. And they see what they expect to see and they don't think anything's wrong. But we really want to train people not to click through those. And that's one kind of sidebar here. One challenge with using self-signed certificates internally is users will get those messages all the time because their browser's not able to look up the certificate in a certificate authority unless you have that stood up internally, and they just automatically get trained to disregard those messages. So you really want to be careful not to have those messages pop up by doing the right security implementations internal to your network, like having a certificate authority and signed certificates and things that the browser will accept. And you can also push rules out via group policy objects and other things to accept internal self-signed certificates as well. But you do want to be cognizant of the error messages that you're training your users potentially not to pay attention to. I've mentioned a few times DNS filtering already, and I wanted to give you a couple of examples and tools that you can use to protect your family online, or even if you have a business. The first tool I have up here is called OpenDNS. This is now part of Cisco, and it's a free tool for personal use. The way this works is you sign up for an account on opendns.com. I've got the URL at the bottom of the left-hand screenshot, and you enter your email address and create a password, and then the tool will identify your public IP address, and then you can tell it you want to protect your home. And on the right-hand side, you see an example of the different menu items that you have. So you can see I'm on the web content filtering screen here, and you can say that you want to protect your home or your small business or something. It's free for home use, so I'll just talk about home use here. You want to protect your home, and you can just say I want to use Cisco's built-in categories. So you can say I want to have filtering level of high. And there you see it says protects against all adult-related sites, illegal activity, social networking, video sharing, and general time wasters. And there's 27 categories that incorporate the high level. Or you could say, well, that's maybe a little too strict. Let's go to moderate. And it's 14 categories. Low is 5. You could say, I don't want anything blocked. Or you can click custom and then apply all of the various categories that you're interested in. This is a really great tool. I've used it at my house for many years. It allows you to route your DNS traffic through Cisco's servers through OpenDNS, and that's how this works, is when OpenDNS sees a DNS request from your home, it will compare it with these categories and say, that website is classified as a gambling site because you've said you don't want gambling sites accessible at your house. It's going to then block your users at home ability to get to that site. There's a lot of other free tools that are part of this. So for example, if a user goes to a site that is labeled as gambling, they will then get a splash screen that comes up. So instead of going to the actual website, they get a screen on their browser that says, you've been blocked from accessing this site. If you'd like to request an exception, please click here. And what it does is it emails you as the administrator that someone is asking to go to a site that's been blocked. One example of this is you might say, I want to block online shopping because you don't want people going to online shopping sites, but that also may block something like Amazon that you legitimately do use. So somebody, once you put the block in for shopping, somebody goes to Amazon, they get the screen that says, sorry, you can't go to the site. They request an exception. It goes to you. You can then say, okay, I do want to continue to block categorically shopping websites. However, I'm going to make an exception for Amazon. And then you can put in, and you see on the screenshot I have at the right where it says manage individual domains, you can say https://amazon.com, either always block, or you can drop that down and say always allow. And you can do this site by site, domain by domain, or again, you can use these larger categories. There's also other things that it gives you, like logging and statistics. So if you want to see who's going to what websites, or you want to see if you've got somebody in your house that's really trying to get to sites that you've blocked, you'll be able to see that too. Now, it won't tell you the user that's trying to do it. It'll just say you're getting requests from your home to go to these following domains. There's also categories of things that are malicious. So domains that have been identified as suspect or known to be on malicious infrastructure or associated with phishing attacks or spam or other things that you would just have blocked. The great thing about that is, just like in a corporate environment that use something like that MDBR tool I showed you from the Center for Internet Security, if you have a user at home that's clicking a link that they got in a text or social media or an email, and it tries to get their computer to go to a malicious website, if that malicious website is known by Cisco, which there's a pretty good chance it is, then that connection will be blocked. So you don't have to worry about them making connection with a known malicious site. So it's not 100% certain it'll always block every attack, but it's a really good and free way to protect your home. Now, if you've got kids at home, little kids especially, and you just don't want them to stumble accidentally in on a site that you would want them to see, then this is another good way to make sure they're not getting to sites that you don't want them to. I used to teach internet safety classes for parents when I was in law enforcement all the time, and this is one of the things I taught parents, is how to implement DNS filtering so they can cut off a lot of potential things coming into their home that they definitely would not want to see. So again, this is OpenDNS, now owned by Cisco. The next one I'm going to show you is Quad 9. This is another free tool. This one's a little bit different and it's also much simpler, but it does not have all the features that OpenDNS does. Quad 9 is available at quad9.net. And it's just as simple as you see on the screenshot here. It says IPv4 address is 9.9.9.9. It's also got a 149.112.112.112 secondary IP address. Or if you're using IP version 6, you see the address is listed there. And that's all you have to do, is go into your DNS settings and set your wireless router for the DNS IP address of, for this example, most of us are on IPv4, so you would do DNS server 1, 9.9.9.9, server 2, 149.112.112.112, and that's it. Now all of your DNS queries from your home will go through Quad 9, and although it does not categorically block things or let you be granular and allow gambling, but don't allow shopping or however you want to set it up, this does block anything that is known or suspected to be malicious host names. And Quad 9 does a really good job of using threat intelligence to keep this list up to date. So it helps block things against malware, phishing, spyware, botnets, all sorts of other things. And again, it's fire and forget. All you have to do is put these IP addresses in your router and you're done. So if you're not really interested in blocking categories of sites or being able to allow certain domains and blocking others, then this might be the way you would want to go, because nobody wants to be able to go to malicious websites. So this was just a really simple way to block that kind of content from coming into your computer. Now, DNS filtering, I mentioned how you can set it up on your router. On this screen here, there's two different ways you can primarily do this, but there's definitely a preferred method. The first is that you set your router up instead of each individual system on your network. The benefit to this is if you have your wireless router set to go to the DNS server of your choice, then every system in your home network that is going through your Wi-Fi will make its DNS queries through your home router, which will then tell it to go to Cisco OpenDNS or Quad 9 or Cloudflare or whatever your preference is. The only exception to that is if a user has manually put in static IP addresses for their DNS servers instead of just inheriting those IP addresses from your default gateway, which is going to be, in most cases, your home router. So you see on the screenshot on the upper right-hand corner where it says 1.1.1.1, 1.1.1.2, this is a screenshot of my home firewall that I have where I set up the default gateway DNS IP addresses to go to Cloudflare, and I use DOH. But you could easily, where it says 1.1.1.1 and 1.1.1.2, you could put the IP addresses here for OpenDNS, for Quad 9, or for something else. As soon as I do that, all the computers and mobile phones and tablets and smart TVs and IoT devices in my house, when they do a DNS query, they will then go to Cloudflare in my instance, but maybe OpenDNS or Quad 9 in yours. If for some reason you cannot make a change to your router, which there are some routers that are really locked down from your ISP. In some cases, you might get a built-in cable modem and wireless router all in one, and you don't have the ability to get into these settings. In those cases, the next best option is to go manually system by system and put in a static IP address for your DNS servers. So on the bottom of the screen, you see a screenshot from a Mac where my Ethernet connection here is getting its IPv4 IP address for the network from DHCP, that Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It's got an IP address of 172.16.1.110. That's my internal RFC 1918 address. My subnet mask, the router, which is a default gateway, which 172.16.1.1, and then DNS servers of 1.1.1.1 and 1.1.1.2. Now I can go in and manually change this. So you could say, I still want to get my IP address on my network from DHCP, so I don't have to worry about it, but I'm going to manually put in the IP addresses of the DNS servers that I want this particular computer to use. So while your router may be fixed to go to your ISP's DNS servers, you can actually force at the system level to go to any DNS server or service that you want. So if you had an instance where you don't really care about your computer and your significant other's computer or your phones, but you do have little kids that are using computers and phones or tablets that they use for school or something, and you want to make sure that those are protected, you could just go into those computers and systems and manually enter in the DNS for cloud or for Cisco OpenDNS, and then those devices, when they made an IP or DNS lookup, would go to Cloudflare or to OpenDNS instead of your ISP's DNS server. So this is just a workaround. Again, you wouldn't want to do that because obviously if systems come and go, you'd have to set it up every single time, but it is better than nothing if you don't have the ability to get into the router, the default gateway that you're using. Now, one caveat I'll say that parents will sometimes forget about is this only works if you are using your home Wi-Fi. If you are using your cell phone provider, so for instance, you put all these blocks in place at your wireless router at home, and your kid turns Wi-Fi off, turns on cell service because you have cell service at home. Now they're surfing any website they want on their cellular device, bypassing all these controls you just made. That is possible. Now there's other ways to circumvent that as well, but I just wanted to let you know that this only works on your wireless router and not any other connection, another person's wireless network that they might have the ability to get on, or their cell phone or something like that. Just be aware that that workaround does exist. Let's move on now to network segmentation, where I'll just give you a high-level overview of what it is and how it's used in security. When we talk about network segmentation, we're really talking about chopping up a larger network into smaller components. Most organizations today still have largely flat networks. And when I talk about a flat network, that means that all the systems can talk to each other. There's no dividing going on where it would block, let's say, a system in the engineering department from communicating with a system in the legal department, or a web server talking to a database or something like that. So network segmentation helps keep all of that from happening. It also enhances our security by limiting the scope of attacks so that attack surface is reduced, so malicious actors don't have the ability to just laterally move across broad sections of an organization. There is some other benefits to segmentation too, and there are some downsides. Some benefit is it does improve performance, and it can reduce network congestion by controlling traffic between different segments. And segments could even be geographical locations. Some organizations will say the Los Angeles office is this network, the New York office is this network, the London office is this network, and by default, none of those can talk to each other. So if the Los Angeles network is compromised, they're shut off. You don't have to worry about New York or London being compromised by that particular attack. And you can even be more granular where you say internally, and you can do this a number of ways. You could do it by use case, by criticality of the data, sensitivity of the data, even departments in your organization. There's lots of different ways to slice this. The downside to it is complex. It can be difficult to implement. It requires a lot of maintenance and just keeping up with IP address schemes and really having a good strategy in place before you even do this. I've implemented network segmentation on some really big global networks, which was originally completely flat, and we went to a very specific and secure network segmentation, and it took a long time to do, but it really gave us a ton of capabilities once it was over with. If you think of network segmentation in a non-IT realm, here's an example. Submarines are designed with these baffles, these segments, as are ships and even like gasoline tankers and water trucks and all sorts of things. So water can't completely slosh around inside of a vehicle, rolling it over or causing some other problems. But in the case of a ship or a submarine, the idea here is that if there's a hole, then only a particular segment might get filled with water instead of the entire ship or submarine filling with water, unless, of course, the hole spans multiple of these compartments or segments. So just like the drawing I have here, where things are clearly defined in different segments, this really is how we want to treat our networks. And even in the home scenario, you might want to have an IoT or an Internet of Things network where your thermostats and your smart TVs and your smoke alarms and your locks and whatever else you have that's an IoT device resides on that network. And then you have all your computers and systems on another production network. You can create firewall rules to say, I can go from my production network to my IoT network in case I want to log into the devices, patch them, monitor them, but at no point can any of those IoT devices go into my production network. So that way, if your smoke alarm gets hacked, the attacker may be able to see other devices in the IoT network, and even that you might be able to control, but it can't see your home network, your laptop, your desktop, or any of those things that you certainly wouldn't want them to be able to see. So that's a really simple way of network segmentation. Just like if you turn your wireless router on at home and it says, do you want to create a guest network? When you do that, you're doing network segmentation. So you can allow friends to come over, connect to your Wi-Fi, give them a different password than you use, and they're on an entirely different network, different address scheme with the IP address, and they can't connect to your home computers if you've set it up the right way. So let's look at how network segmentation can actually work. This is an example of a flat network. So here in what I've got produced here, you see you've got the sales department. Now, one way you can tell a flat network is by the IP address scheme. So you see these are 192.168.1.x. In this case that I have underlined, it's 1.54. Again, these are those RFC 1918 internal non-publicly routable IP addresses. So the sales department has these IPs for their system. You go down to the legal department, they're also 192.168.1.15. So by default, without any other firewall rules or access control lists, ACLs, or anything else, there's nothing preventing these from talking to each other because they're on the same network. You look over here at engineering, they're also 192.168.1.x, and finance 192.168.1.x. So all of these systems can talk to each other. This system should be able to ping that system, again, without any other controls that would prevent it. This system can ping this system or any of the systems across the entire network. Now you start throwing web servers on here, internal databases, printers, VoIP phones. They're all on the same IP address. They can all see each other. They can all talk to each other. It's a very dangerous, cybersecurity-wise anyway, position to be in. And that's why you want to really think about how you segment your network. And I'll show you in the next slide one way you might be able to do that. Here is the same kind of example we looked at before, but this is configured differently. So you see here we still have our switch in the middle, but this switch is now divided into what's called virtual local area networks, or VLANs. These VLANs allow us to program the switch to say which ports are allowed to be tagged with certain VLANs, or which traffic can be allowed to traverse those ports. So you would set this switch up to say, okay, this port is VLAN 10, but nothing else. And let's say this is VLAN 20, and this is 30, and this is 40, just as an example. Now, if you say all ports can talk to all VLANs, that's not a great security solution. So you want to make sure that you are programming your switches correctly. But in this example, now the sales department is 192.168, still 1.x on this RFC 1918 network. And you see that it's got these 1.x IP addresses. But then when we go to VLAN 20 down here for the legal department, well, they're now on 192.168.2.62. Because these two are now on different networks, 1 dot versus 2 dot, they cannot natively talk to each other. So the legal department computers have no knowledge whatsoever of the sales department, and vice versa. And then you see the same thing. Engineering is 3 dot and finance is 4 dot. Now these VLAN 10, 20, 30, 40, that's just an example. You can number VLANs however you want, and something else that you want to think about in your IP addressing strategy and network segmentation. But the great thing about how this is now laid out is, let's say a user in the engineering department gets a phishing email, they click a link, and their system is now compromised. Well, as soon as the attacker gets on it, they start following the attack kill chain, and they start doing reconnaissance, and they scan for systems that they can talk to. And they see this system, and they see this system, and they see this system, probably anything on the 192.168.3 network, although they could have been further scoped down, but we'll just say for this example that they can see everything there. But when they're scanning, they're not seeing finance or legal or sales. They don't even know necessarily that those exist. As far as they're concerned, this is all that they have access to. So you can see why this is so really important. Now, in an incident response case, you actually want to create a VLAN for IR. And we generally will call this a remediation VLAN. And you would want to number it something that's really obvious that no one would ever use. And in that remediation VLAN, you would have systems, you'd be able to move systems into the remediation VLAN and have it locked down where only your IR team and tools could get to it. So you might, let's say this engineering department is compromised, or you have a couple systems that are compromised. You could, on the back end, move these systems to the IR VLAN, And then you can have tighter control over who can talk to it. So you could say all of my IR tools can get to it. We can do forensics on these machines. You may even still have some internet connectivity so the attackers don't know that you're onto them. But that's, of course, a bigger decision based on what's going on if they're exfiltrating data. But it is something good to consider to be able to have some sort of IR VLAN set up for your team in advance. When you think of network security tools, it's usually tools that are doing something like looking at signatures to find attacks based on matching of malicious signatures, or some sort of machine learning, or maybe even AI that is looking at traffic analysis patterns and things that would flag as being potentially anomalous or suspicious. There's a couple of different kinds of threats that we look at when we do network traffic analysis, and some ways to categorize them. Now, this is from what Donald Rumsfeld had created for not cyber threats, but more physical threats. But I think it plays pretty well into cybersecurity as well. So, for example, known threats. These are things that we know. The facts, the data, the situations that we are aware of and we fully understand. For example, we know the vulnerabilities that exist and the threats that are available to exploit them. Known unknowns are things that we know we don't know. They represent some sort of gap in our knowledge that we're aware of and can take steps to investigate or address. For example, we may know that somebody in our company is using a cloud service provider for something, but we're not exactly sure what yet. We need to go find that out. Or we may know that we have assets and software on our network that we don't have fully documented or inventoried. So those are known unknowns. Then we have unknown unknowns. These are things we don't even know we don't know. These are unpredictable risks or challenges that we cannot possibly foresee because we're just not aware of them at all. So these are those generally low frequency but high risk events that we should be aware of. And then finally, unknown knowns. These are things we don't realize we know. And that kind of sounds a little weird, but what I mean by that is it's some sort of information or insights that actually are available to us, but we just either didn't understand what it meant, we didn't fully look at them to grasp the information that was available to us, or we saw it but we didn't realize how important it was. So those are unknown knowns. And if we bucketize different network security tools and analytics into these, it can kind of give you a framework to think through each of these. How do you deal with known knowns? How do you apply signatures to them or something like that? And I'll show you in the next slide how these actually apply more in a cybersecurity perspective. Now let's break this down from a cyber perspective. Known knowns. Remember, I went over those. Examples of this are allow lists or correlating things going on with lists. We talked about this a little bit with DNS, but it could be having cyber threat intelligence that provides you with lists of known bad IP addresses, known bad domain names, URLs, infrastructure being used for criminal activity. So that's where you would get those known knowns. Also, it could be things like multiple account failures. Especially if it's over a geographical period. If you see one user account failed logging into France and then in New York and then in Los Angeles, all within the period of 15 minutes, you know that's physically impossible. So it's either some sort of VPN or it's an adversary bouncing around or multiple adversaries trying to get into that user's account. The known unknowns, examples there are things like supervised or unsupervised machine learning. We understand the attacks, but we don't actually know if they're happening. So we know there's certain types of attacks going on in the world or in our industry, but we don't have the particular visibility to know if they're happening to us. Sometimes this may be based on known bad behavior. So we might train tools to look for known bad. You might say, I know this kind of thing happens. Here's what it would look like. I just don't know if it's happening here. And you'd have some tool go look for those kind of events. And this is often called anomaly detection with things like machine learning. Then the unknown unknowns. This is where we do more deep learning. A lot of cyber tools are just coming up to speed with this now, but traditionally they haven't been great at it. But a lot of the AI developments over the last couple of years has made this much better. This is where we see AI tools doing deep learning, also humans training AI to look through. AI might flag something and a human would say, actually, that's legitimate, or no, you're right, that's malicious, giving it different models to work through in different scenarios. can really be helpful. AI does a great job of identifying things that you may never have guessed in those unknown categories. Especially if you have something like a data lake or a data warehouse where you're putting more, even on the data lake side, just a bunch of unstructured data, and you're having something like AI go through it and put things together that there's no way a person would be able to do, just because they don't have the time, the resources, or wouldn't be able to go through that amount of data and understand the correlations like AI can do. So that's where we would see those unknowns come into play. Let's take a look at this network architecture example of what a simple company network may look like. So in this example, we have internal systems that are represented here on the bottom, and those internal systems have a sandbox between them and the firewall. And this sandbox here could be used, let's say, to look at attachments and links that are inside of emails, but also it may be looking at files that are traversing the network. So if this user had reached out to download something from the internet and it pulled a file back down, if it cleared the firewall, then the sandbox might look at that file first before allowing it to reach the actual end user's desktop. And then we've got, of course, the firewall, probably some sort of unified threat management firewall that has firewall capabilities as well as intrusion detection and prevention, and maybe other things too. And then, of course, the public internet, and going to some sort of web server or other resource on the internet. Now, oftentimes organizations will have something, if they do things correctly like this, where they have this segment off to the side that is usually called a DMZ or demilitarized zone. So in this DMZ, they could have public-facing systems that are available. Let's say this is their HR system, where you can submit some sort of paperwork, apply for positions, that sort of thing. And maybe they've got a GIS system that has public data about tax information, and this could just be their website server that is available online. And behind all of these, or these are all behind this web application firewall. And even then, between the firewall and the WAF is an intrusion prevention system. So let's say you have a user out on the public internet here that is trying to get to your HR system. So they would come through the public internet. They would say, I'm looking for whatever the IP address is of your HR system. You would go to the firewall, and there may be some other devices in between here, like a router or something. But for this example, it goes to the firewall. It says, I'm trying to find such and such. The firewall knows that that is over in the DMZ. It does not allow it to traverse into the corporate network at all. In fact, it routes it this way. The intrusion prevention system looks at the packets to make sure they're properly formed, and it's what we would expect. It then goes to the web application firewall, which does an even deeper inspection to make sure that it's not just looking at signatures, but other parts of the actual packets itself. And then it makes a decision, as does the IPS, of whether or not that traffic should be allowed to the HR system. At any point, the firewall, the IPS, or the WAF could go through and block that traffic from getting to the destination. But if everything looks good, then it will allow the traffic to go back and forth, and it will understand that this session is in progress. That session, though, does not stop IPS or WAF from continuing to inspect it in case something goes awry and someone starts launching some attacks. One example could be a SQL injection attack, where this attacker finds this HR system, makes a connection, starts looking through, maybe trying to do some directory traversals or something like that, and then starts launching a SQL injection attack. Well, the IPS system should have signatures, the WAF certainly will identify that, and they will just cut the session off completely. And all of these should be going into a security operations center that's monitoring what's going on. Now, all of this happens without these internal users being aware of it whatsoever, and at no time should there be the ability for someone on the outside to come all the way in to the inside, except if a session was initiated first internally that went out, and then that session comes back in. of course, going through all of these. Now, again, this is a very simplified view. We might have a lot of other security tools in here. If we think about our defense in depth, we could have an IDPS here. We could have multiple email gateways, proxies, a lot of different things. But I just wanted to show you a pretty simple setup here. And you may be saying, well, that's a lot more complicated than mine. And that could be. You might not have a WAF, for instance, in your DMZ, but maybe you've got an IPS, or maybe the firewall has built-in IDPS, and you've just segmented your firewall for the DMZ to be on one network and your internal network to be on another. But again, just one example of how this might work in practice. Let's look at a little more complex example here. This one I wanted to talk about. We have two separate drawings here, obviously, but how some of these can be modified to do more analysis of what's going on. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the public internet. There's a core router. Remember last time I said we may have some more things in line between the internet and the firewall. Here's a core router, and in this situation, a router can be a great place to offload and deny traffic. So you might put rules in that just drops packets that come from certain destinations or looking for certain things, and that helps decrease the CPU and RAM utilization of something like an IDPS or a firewall or something like that. So here we've got our core router. It's going to a core switch. Now, in most cases, if this was a large enterprise, there would be two of all of these things in what we call an HA pair, high availability. So if one goes down, the other one stays up, and it's a failover, and that way your whole network doesn't go down because of a hardware failure. And that even includes firewalls, and it can get really expensive really quick, but that's the cost of doing business if you require that kind of uptime. In this example here, we've got our switch, and off the switch we have a span or a mirror port that is copying all this traffic going back and forth over to our intrusion detection system. So this is an IDS. It is not inline. It is not a prevention system. It is a detection system, which helps in some ways because as traffic goes through here, a copy of this traffic goes over to the IDS. It then monitors it, and if there's a signature match on something malicious, it would then notify the SOC. The nice part of this is you never have to worry about the IDS failing and taking the network down or it blocking legitimate traffic, anything like that, because it's not in line. The downside to this is that somebody needs to be watching this at the SOC, and even if the IDS starts detecting things, there's no actual action being taken. There's no disconnection of traffic or anything like that. It's still allowed to go through. It's just not it's just reporting to the SOC basically. So that's an example of a intrusion detection system that's just hanging off to the side there. And in this example, we have users and even Wi-Fi, and all of these are connected to a switch, which then is fed into the perimeter firewall here. Now, in the example on the right, same kind of thing. We've got the public internet, we've got our core router, we've got the core switch. This one, we have that DMZ that I talked about last time, where we've got some public-facing things here that are being protected by a WAF. And again, there's no connectivity from these systems into the internal network, and there's no connectivity from the public internet down to our internal network unless we from the inside initiate those first. Now, in this example, we don't have an IDS, we have an IPS, and it's actually in line. So we've got our firewall and we've got our user. So if the user connects to something and starts bringing files down, and the IPS inspects it and says, oh, that's a malicious file, or that IP address matches a known signature, or this is a malformed packet, or whatever, it's just going to chop that signal right off, and the user is not going to be able to do that. And whether you're coming in from Wi-Fi or a hardwired Ethernet cable desktop, it doesn't matter. If it's all behind this network, the IPS system is going to see it. Now, in some cases, there's going to be one device. It may not have a firewall and a separate IPS. It could be the firewall, as I mentioned before, has a unified threat management or UTM capability where it also has a built-in IPS with the firewall itself. One thing you got to watch out for that is your throughput, because when you start enabling security things like IPS, it does make an impact on bandwidth sometimes and processing capabilities, because it's got to look at all that traffic as it traverses the firewall. So you do want to keep that in mind, and you want to make sure you spec your firewalls and your IDSs and IPSs to the network size. Is it a 1 gig network, 10 gig, 40 gig, whatever gig network you have? You want to make sure that your fiber connections, your ports, your switches, and the capabilities of your devices are all beefy enough to handle the throughput without any impact to your users. So if the users decide, hey, we need to go from a 10 to a 40 gig connection for business capabilities, great. Not only is that an IT expense, but it also means all of this stuff from a security perspective most likely needs to be upgraded. So you want to definitely keep that in mind too. Now, one thing I've got here you see is this north and south and east and west. North and south traffic is kind of what it sounds like. You've got traffic coming in north and south of your network. So you are able to watch that and monitor it with an IDS or something like that. East-west traffic, though, people don't do as much monitoring of because it's more difficult in some cases, and oftentimes they don't have the infrastructure in place to do it. That's one benefit to network segmentation, is if we segmented this network, we could put users in one. If you remember that example I had before, like engineering and legal were in two totally separate networks because they had been segmented. You could put taps in the switches on all the segments and actually do IDPS examination of packets flowing internally back and forth laterally across the networks, which is a great idea to do, especially if you have one of your segments being like critical information. So this could have your internal databases, your personally identifiable information, social security numbers, healthcare, etc. And this is on one network. We'll say 192.168.5.x, and your users are on something like 192.168.1.x, and you make a firewall rule that allows certain users to get in here. However, you're going to put a firewall and an IDPS here that is inspecting and logging all of this traffic. And you can do access control lists, ACLs, and other rules to really strictly tighten this down to who can get in, what they can get into, what kind of traffic can go through here, all on an internal network, and be looking at that east-west kind of traffic as well. I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access. Sometimes you might hear it referred to as Zero Trust Network Architecture. And I'm not going to deep dive this a lot, but I did want to cover it at a very high level. The one thing about ZTNA, or Zero Trust, is you hear a lot. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot by vendors and organizations. But the problem is it's not really well named, because it's not zero trust. At some point, you have to trust a legitimate user to be able to do what they need to do to get their job done. It's really more of a mindset. And zero trust doesn't, as I've got on the slide here, imply a complete lack of trust, but it's rather the removal of complete implicit trust. So instead of just saying you're an employee, you now have a network set of credentials and you can get to anything that's on the network, we don't say that anymore, hopefully at least, but we've got some checks that have to be made and policies in place that dictate what users can go to what resource. So it's zero implicit trust is really kind of the better way to say this. Now, ZTNA assumes that threats can exist both inside and outside the network, which of course is true. We see insider threat cases a lot, and having that set of restrictions and policies in place to check for outsider threats and insider threats is a critical part of zero trust network access. It's really meant to only grant permissions to data or to systems once a risk-appropriate vetting has occurred, and then explicit trust can be verified that this user and this device is allowed to get to whatever resource they're trying to get to. We use access controls in ZTNA, and those are enforced by validating the identity, the security posture, and the behavior of users, devices, and applications. and making sure we always adhere to the principle of least privilege. That's a lot to say that it's not just the user, even not that long ago, and still today in some organizations, when you get a username and a password to an Active Directory environment, let's say, or to a Google Workspace environment or Office 365 environment, you may have everything that's available to that organization that you can get into. So the security posture is even looking at things like patch levels. I know in some organizations that I work with, as soon as the user logs in, it does a quick scan of the device to make sure it's up to speed in patching. Remember, I talked back about the remediation VLAN and the IR VLAN when you talk about network segmentation. Some agencies, if you log in and your patch level is low, you automatically get moved into a remediation VLAN where you can connect to SCCM or whatever system they have to push patches. Your system is then patched. You may have to reboot a couple times. You get all the patches you need. And once it does a posture check and confirms that your system is where it needs to be safe, then it will move you into the production VLAN. But from the remediation VLAN, you can only get to cyber tools and IT tools, but not to any other systems or databases or intranet pages or any of those things because you're just too high risk. And then we also look at applications. Should you even be able to get to certain applications, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem? And the least privileged access is a really important concept that a lot of organizations don't implement because, frankly, it's hard and it's also a cultural issue. But what this really says is you should only have the level of access that's absolutely necessary for you to do your job. It is not acceptable to have every user be full administrators locally on their machines. That's a recipe for disaster. But a lot of organizations do that out of necessity so they can add printers or install software because they don't have the IT staff or the time to get involved in those things. But the problem is if you're an administrator on your machine and you click a link that's malicious, well, now you have administrator credentials and you can install that malware. Where if I was just a standard user and I click the link, it may try and install the malware and pop up the user acceptance or trying to escalate privileges, asking me to log in as an administrator, which right there should be a red flag. Something's going on. But if I don't have administrative credentials, most likely there are some malware variants out there that they may be able to infect the machine without doing that. It may have privilege escalation as part of the malware. But for the most part, if you're not an administrator, then they may not be able to get the malware to run. So it's making sure that you only have the level of access, whether it's to data, applications, or systems, that you absolutely have to do your job. There are a lot of tools out there, PAM tools, PAM, privileged access management tools that can help organizations with this. They can do just-in-time passwords. They can use tools like CyberArk that gives you a temporary password. So some organizations have software developers, for instance, that may need to escalate privileges to deploy software into production. They can use a tool like CyberArk where they can check out an administrative password, which is all audited. It's only good for, let's say, 24 hours. They can do the job they need to do, and then that administrative password is reset and it's not available to be used again. So there are tools out there, but again, that requires a level of sophistication and budget to be able to do those. So if we replace implicit trust with explicit trust and always do continuous verification, so even if you're allowed, okay, you're a good user, check. Your device is the company standard, check. Your patch level is good. You're allowed to get to this application. So now you're in, but part of zero trust is that continuous monitoring, looking for suspicious traffic. For a user that maybe is allowed to get into the HR share, but not the legal share, but they're continuously trying to get into the legal share, and it's starting to throw up error messages that someone in cybersecurity should be getting and figuring out, well, is this a misconfiguration? Is there a service that's trying to do this on behalf of the user? Or do we have a user that's just poking around trying to get into things that they probably shouldn't be? So that's part of zero trust too, making sure we're always checking on things. And if we see somebody try and exceed their scope, or we see Josh always logs in around this date at this time on these days of the week from New York, but all of a sudden we're seeing activity in a different part of the country or way outside of normal business hours, that may automatically reduce access. Might not cut me off completely, but it may reduce access. It might send some sort of alert to a SOC. And then depending on what I might be doing, or when I say me, my account, because it could be compromised, is doing, then it may just completely remove access altogether. But there's tools out there to look at those kinds of activities and determine, is this normal? Do we usually see this from this person, or is this something that we should take a closer look at? Now let's jump into VPNs, or virtual private networks. A VPN is a secure connection between two or more devices over the internet. And this allows users to send and receive data just like they were on the same private network. A lot of times we see companies use this where they allow users to install a client on their computer and they connect to that client, they put their username and password in, and all of a sudden that computer is essentially just like if the person was in the office. They've got that virtual private network VPN established, their communications are encrypted, and it looks like that device is part of the network. And some organizations require your device to be a company or agency-owned computer to be able to connect via VPN. Others allow BYOD computers to connect via VPN as well. It depends on your risk appetite, your tools, your resources, and what it is that you're trying to accomplish to make some of those decisions. VPNs use encryption to protect data, so that makes sure that everything from end to end, from your computer to the destination within that network that you're connecting to, is secure, encrypted, and not able to be eavesdropped on by some sort of an attacker. VPNs create this secure tunnel, so it's really an encrypted tunnel between your computer and wherever it is you're ultimately going. Now, the example I gave in the company where you connect via VPN and now you're essentially on the inside of the network is one use case for VPNs, but another one is you may be using this at home to give yourself additional privacy and anonymity on the internet. There's a lot of use cases for VPNs personally. One is maybe you're a journalist and you don't want to have your data and your research and where you're going found out by your internet service provider or a foreign government or someone like that. Maybe you're just, you don't like the ISPs and internet providers like Facebook or other Instagram, etc., seeing all of your traffic and then giving you ads that are associated with it or otherwise kind of spying on your traffic. You might use a VPN for some of that too. So there's a lot of good reasons to use a VPN. And while a company perspective is one, but personally, you may just want to make sure that your traffic is encrypted end to end on your personal device. For instance, if you're going to use your computer at the Starbucks, at the airport, at a hotel, those are generally all public Wi-Fi. And with Wi-Fi, everybody on the same network sees a lot of your traffic. And so a VPN will cut all of that off. And I'll show you in a diagram how that really works. Okay, let's say you're at home and you've got a desktop computer that's on your home network. You've got a 192.168.1.2 IP address on that machine. Your default gateway, your wireless router is 1.1, and your public IP address for your home is this 66.23.124.33 IP. So one thing to know, if you're not familiar with how this works already, is in your home network, and same with a company as well, is there's these internal IP addresses that you've heard me talk about before. The RFC 1918 request for comment is what RFC stands for. These are IP addresses that are not publicly routable. They allow us to have multiple computers behind a single public IP address that we get from our internet service provider. So the way this works is we get an IP address assigned to us from our ISP. That's our public IP address right here that's circled. And that's the one IP address that's assigned to our business or to our home. And any traffic that comes out of our home network is assigned this public IP address. So it doesn't matter how many systems you have on this side of things, it's all, once it hits the public internet, it all comes from that one single IP address. And you can look up public IP addresses to see what internet service provider has them associated. So we'll say Spectrum, for instance, might have this one, but you can look them up with plenty of free resources. You can check your own public IP to see what it is. It can change over time because ISPs use what's called DHCP. I mentioned this before, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and that allows them to have a pool of IP addresses and hand them out at will, because there's two different kinds of IP addresses. There's IP version 4, which I'm showing on all my slides, and then there's IP version 6, which if you've ever seen an IPv6 address, it's a much longer 128-bit, much longer IP address. And I'm not going to get into that in this class, but most ISPs are still giving out IPv4 addresses. The reason we have these RFC 1918 internal IP addresses is because we've run out of IPv4 addresses, and that's why IPv6 came along as well. So there's a technology that's called NAT, Network Address Translation. And what NAT allows us to do is have all of these different systems in our home or business network that are assigned these internal IP addresses. And as they travel out of our network and consolidate to this one public IP address we have, the router here in the middle takes this into account, and it assigns different high-level ports to these different devices on the inside. So if you've got 17 devices at home all going out to the public internet, all asking for various things, your router is what keeps track as they go out, because all of them on the outside are going to have this public IP address. When they go out, they're going to say, okay, Josh's computer was asking for Google, and because I matched in the routing table, I know that Josh's computer was assigned this 58,002 port, and that's went out to Google. So when it comes back on that port, I know that needs to go to Josh's computer on the inside. And if another person went out to Bing at that same time, they're going to have a different port associated with it, and that's how it's going to route it back internally. And so NAT allows organizations to have multiple IP addresses on the inside of the network, only going out with this one public IP. This also, as a side note, is why it is really a bad idea to allow people to do things on your network that might get the attention of law enforcement or somebody like that, because it's all going to come back to your public IP address. So when the police see an IP address associated with criminal activity, if it's from your house, they're going to be knocking on your door, and that's how they're going to trace it back. It's not going to be evident to them which computer did it, just which IP did it. So from a VPN's perspective, along the top here, let's just talk about how things work without a VPN, and that's what I'm displaying on this top set of graphs here. So images here, your computer at .2 requests some sort of website that or some resource on the internet that goes through your internet service provider and is routed to the resource. Now, at all points between your home and the resource, everyone here can see that your IP address has asked for this. The resource at the end sees it's your IP address. Anybody between your ISP and that resource sees it's your IP address, and that's, of course, how it ends up getting it back to you, is it has to know where it comes from. The downside to this is that if you're going to a website that you prefer them not to see it's coming from your house, maybe you're doing some research or you're trying to avoid detection because you don't want some foreign government to know that you're looking on their website, or who knows what the reason is, or you just don't want ad companies to see where you're going, then if you don't use a VPN, they'll be able to see it is your IP address. And there are companies out there that compile all this data, and eventually, depending on the websites you go to and the things that you do online and everything that captures your IP address, they can pretty much understand who you are without having to do like a court order or something like law enforcement would to get your true identity, or at least the internet service provider customer's true identity. So having people see your IP address in all sorts of online transactions really does provide a lot of detail to them, and it jeopardizes privacy for users. So now let's look at what a VPN connection would look like that I have down here in this gray box. So here we have the same computer at your house, and you want to connect to something. So you connect to your default gateway, exact same process so far. Your computer's .2, you connect to .1, which is your access point. Here's your public IP address, exact same one that we saw above. But instead of going through your ISP to get to this resource, you now get bounced through your VPN connection. And this is because you have a client running on your computer that is encrypting your computer traffic from your actual computer all the way through to wherever your destination is. So the VPN provider routes you then through to the resource that you were wanting to go to. The interesting thing that happens here is, a couple things. One is this entire amount of traffic is encrypted. So this is why it's so critically important to use a VPN if you're at Starbucks, at the airport, at a hotel, because anyone else on that same network, instead of seeing your DNS queries and the websites you're going to and IP address information, they're only going to see your source IP address connecting to your VPN provider. And everything is encrypted. So they have no idea what you're doing, what websites you're visiting, what files you're downloading. None of that stuff is visible to them. It's also not visible to your internet service provider. So they know you're online. They know you're going to this VPN IP, but that's it. That's as much as they know. Now, when you go to your destination, in this case, it's 149.102.252.25 IP address. That's the VPN IP address. But when you get to your destination here, all this destination is going to see is the VPN's IP address. They are not going to see your public IP address whatsoever. So this allows the provider at the end to just see this IP address. And one thing you can do with VPNs as well is you can determine what country or even what state, and if you're in the US, you want to come from. So you could say, I want to bypass, if you're in a country that restricts internet connectivity, for example, you can install a VPN, connect to a server outside of your country. The country is only going to see this encrypted HTTPS traffic, which they're going to think is any normal website surfing, but in fact, it's you establishing this VPN tunnel, and then you're able to bypass controls if they say, well, you're not allowed to go to any server in this particular country. Well, a VPN would allow you to bypass it. In fact, you could make it look like you're from the very country that you're not supposed to be going to. So there's a lot of benefits to VPNs, from privacy to security. Now, one thing that can happen is there's plenty of organizations out there that track the IP address of VPN providers. So sometimes you will go to a website and it won't even load, or you'll get an error that you're not allowed to connect from a VPN or something along those lines. And then you have to make the decision, do you really want to go there, or maybe you forgot you even had your VPN on and it's something that you don't care if anybody knows you're going to. But just be aware that there is the possibility of organizations and cyber threat intelligence groups tracking these IP addresses associated with VPN infrastructure. And it's usually not a big deal, but it does happen from time to time, so you just want to be aware of that. We just covered more about home VPN usage. I want to talk a bit more about enterprises. And I did in the front end of this tell you about how businesses use VPNs, but there's a couple other points that I just want to cover here. Remember that VPNs can be used to allow remote workers to come in and be just like they're sitting in the office with their computer to access network resources and things that they should never be able to get to on the outside. And that's because that VPN client that creates that encrypted tunnel essentially makes it like that computer is sitting on the inside of the network. VPNs are kind of falling out of favor toward other things like zero trust network access and other tools that are out there that allow people to come in through web portals or using virtual machines instead of a VPN, although there's still a lot of people using VPNs, so you'll definitely encounter them if you don't use them every day already. Enterprises also use VPNs to segment networks. So if you have multiple locations, for instance, one option may be using dark fiber or MPLS links between two different locations. Another option might be using VPNs. So you might have a firewall or a VPN concentrator at the perimeter of one location, and maybe a remote branch site has a VPN concentrator on that end, and it establishes a point-to-point encrypted VPN tunnel. And it's always up, always on, and that way you can have remote site offices being just like they're in the same physical infrastructure as your other office, and allows people to communicate internally, share files, access resources, just like they're all on the same network, because they essentially are, even though that encrypted tunnel is traveling over the public internet. And VPNs also help businesses protect their sensitive data. Things like GDPR, HIPAA, and other requirements require that data is transmitted, sometimes and stored encrypted. So you might hear something like, it must be encrypted at rest, or it must be encrypted in transit. And if you don't have the ability, or maybe you have an application that isn't up to speed enough to automatically encrypt traffic, using a VPN might be a solution to that problem, where you can encapsulate the packets of information that otherwise would be unencrypted in an encrypted VPN tunnel. You can even use these internally to networks too. So if you had a particularly sensitive, let's say, database that's on a legacy system that does not support HTTPS, and you can't upgrade the ciphers to be up to the level you really should be for encryption, one option is to implement a VPN on either end and encrypt the traffic that way. So you don't have to worry about whether or not the application will support it, because you're using hardware devices or potentially software to do that for you. Some VPN considerations just to think through. One is enhanced security. I've mentioned before, VPNs provide an additional layer of security, especially for remote connections and those public internet times, such as at the coffee shop or at the airport. They also provide anonymity and privacy because they mask your IP address and encrypt your data. There could be a performance impact though. VPNs sometimes can slow down internet speeds because now you're encrypting traffic and you're bouncing it through somewhere else. Sometimes that remote server could be states away or countries away, depending on what you're using. You also need to have trust in your VPN provider. Your VPN provider may be your company and they're using their own VPN hardware to be able to create that encrypted tunnel, or you might be using a VPN provider. In those cases, you want to make sure you're using a reputable VPN provider that has a strict no logs policy. If you're using a VPN to stay anonymous and keep your internet traffic private, you don't necessarily want a bunch of logs available that show your home IP address and then what VPN IP address you received, because it'd be very easy to trace everything back and still discover who the person is. Obviously, we should never be using these things to do anything illegal or unethical, but the reason that a lot of people use VPNs is not to go commit crimes, although certainly people do that. It's to maintain your privacy and your security from all sorts of threats, both people eavesdropping in networks, but also, as I mentioned before, advertisers and organizations that are just trying to scoop up as much data about you as possible to then sell and really be able to put together quite a dossier on internet history, IP address information, all sorts of things like that, that using a VPN really makes it much more difficult, if not impossible, depending on what else you're doing, to make that happen. And then I mentioned before the VPN blockage. Sometimes websites or organizations will block known VPN IP addresses. That is something you might run into. Again, it's not very common, but it is something that happens. So you just need to be aware that that could, in fact, be a challenge for you. Here's some examples of VPN providers. There's lots of them out there. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure you trust the VPN provider. These are 3 examples where I've personally used and vetted, have clients that use them. And while there are others, I can speak to these for sure, so I thought I'd provide them as examples. The one on the upper left-hand corner, Proton VPN, is very well known. A lot of government organizations and people use this. Proton has a number of capabilities, including encrypted and anonymous emails, their Drive, it's much like Google Drive or Dropbox, and then VPN. You can buy a whole suite of it, or if you're just interested in the VPN, you can get that too. It's fairly inexpensive. There's a code below that if you use, it can get you up to 40% off, I believe, of a year subscription, which is already pretty inexpensive. So if you're looking for a VPN provider, Proton is a great option, and it allows you to have clients or agents on your phones, iPhone, Android, Mac, Linux, Windows, etc. And you can even set up to automatically connect to the VPN if you want to, or you can just connect it whenever you want to have it on. The other one in the middle, Outline, is actually a product made by Google. They made this as part of their journalist package to help keep journalists safe and keep their online activity hidden from government organizations that may want to know what they're up to. Outline's a little bit more difficult to implement because there's 2 parts to it. I've also done this for clients before, and it's not hard to do, but it does take a little bit more time. And it also requires you to have some sort of server infrastructure. So with Outline, it allows you to create your own personal private VPN. And the way it works is you get some sort of resource online. It could be an Azure server, an AWS server, Vultr, or any of these organizations that provide server infrastructure. And you install an agent on that. You can do it really inexpensive through something like AWS Lightsail, which is a very inexpensive Linux server that you can run command line only. You can install Outline on it. It'll generate cryptographic keys that you then use in the agent, the Outline agent that you would put on your phone, your computer, or whatever else. And then you put the key in, that cryptographic key, into your agent, and it connects to your virtual server. And then anytime you do anything, you're fully encrypted and you're bouncing through that virtual server that you created. So it's, again, more private to you. It's not like you're using a commercial service, but you also have to maintain it and know how to set it up. Then you have TunnelBear. I haven't used this one as much. I have had a couple of clients use this with really good success. I've certainly investigated the company and I have used it some, but if I had to recommend another one where it's a little bit more simple like Proton, then TunnelBear would be my next option. And that's it for this network security and defense in-depth overview. Again, it was just an introduction to give you some concepts and some information about how layered security or defense in-depth is used in cybersecurity, and then a little bit about some of these common things that we have to think through from a cyber perspective to keep our networks and our systems safe. I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, if you're interested in getting continuing education credit for watching this, make sure to click the link below and sign up for this on Natsar.com, where you can get the same course but get a certificate for attending. If you have questions, please leave them below in the comments and I will review all of them and answer them to the best I can. And if you like it, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for any future updates. Thank you.